Hello, everybody. Welcome to our June Fika with Friends. This marks a full year of Fikas for us, so it's quite a month, and we've celebrated in various ways, which we can update you about another time. This month we're discussing SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and in particular target 8.2, which is to achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading and innovation, including through a focus on high value added and labour intensive sectors. So it seems a great time to reflect on the enormous increase in interest that we are seeing around the creation of outdoor workplaces at the moment. And we'll be discussing the move towards creating these workspaces that work outdoors, initially conceived to improve health and well-being, and now being expedited by the post-COVID recovery. And our experts this month are Barry Jenkins of BroomeJenkins, experienced specialists in workplace and product design, and Oliver Heath, who is a biophilic architect and globally recognised expert in the field of sustainable architectural and interior design. And the last time I watched Oliver on TV, I did tell him this, it was on DIY SOS. It was through mounds of soggy tissues, which is the normal way, unfortunately for me, when I'm watching those programs. So it might be a good time to turn your cameras on, Barry and Oliver, so that we can welcome you properly. Hello.
Hi there.
Thank you. And so welcome to both Barry and Oliver. And I'm Romy, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the commercial director at Vestra here in the UK. And I should just mention, you'll have heard that we're recording this webinar for catch-up purposes. So I hope you're happy with that, but please let me know if you're not for any particular reason. And so what we're talking about today in more detail is this topic, which I think may come as a surprise in terms of the SDGs, which people often think are around inequality, poverty, and environmental concerns. But here we're considering higher productivity and innovation, both of which are direct consequences of working in healthy and supportive environments. So I'm sure this is slightly new to you in terms of the SDGs, and you may have a number of questions about this new approach. So please add them to the Q&A tab, if you could, rather than the chat tab, and join the conversation after both Barry and Oliver's presentations. So over to you, Barry, if you're ready. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, here you go.
So is that clear? Can everyone see that?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Romy, for inviting me to talk today. This talk is partly around some work we've recently done with Romy and Vestra, looking at how their products can be applied to outdoor work settings, and so we'll go through that in detail in a moment. But just by way of a brief introduction, BroomeJenkins, we're a very small company, essentially we're product designers, but we have a very keen interest in how space works. So everything that we've done generally relates to some kind of enabling of spaces, and our clients include local authorities, community groups, property companies, but mainly manufacturers. Work broadly falls into two areas: urban design, which is around strategies for regeneration, wayfinding, street furniture and placemaking, and mainly workplace projects, research-led new product development. And there's an overlap between the two, because we increasingly see that it's really about placemaking, even in the workplace. The images below on the right, some examples of work. The large picture is an idea it was part of the city centre vision that we did with our local authority, Chichester District Council, and it was a way of making the only city centre car park a marketplace. And so we created this sort of collapsible structure. Images at the bottom show some of our more regular work, which is strictly product. So we have a mobile screen for Icon, the detail shot of a very finely sort of resolved height adjustable desk for Boss Design Group, and our most recent product launched, which is a smart backpack for a company called Hotbox, who've been focusing on the nomadic worker for many years. They're certainly ahead of the curve. And then the pictures on the left just show the studio and the team. I've worked with Julian since 2004, very capable experienced product designer. He's responsible for just about everything that we produce technically. Don, I first employed 20 years ago when he came from Australia. We worked on the Liverpool wayfinding program. He then went on to work with Wood for a number of years, designing signage and street furniture. And today he's studying an MA in sustainable design, and he works with us occasionally. And then in the centre is Alice, who I can only really describe as a force of nature. She's I met her as a student when I was tutoring on the MA at High Wycombe. And today she's a furniture designer, but she runs a specialist marketing company and is also co-author or co-editor and publisher of a local magazine, South Coast Journal, sort of lifestyle thing. So between us, we've got a lot of broad experiences. And then as we're talking about decent work and decent workplaces, just a picture of the studio, which until 2 years ago was a burnt out wreck of a milking parlour in a plot of land next to where I live. And today we're very fortunate. We've got a great studio, good workshop, and a really nice setting. And it helps. It really helps with if we talk about good workplaces, we really need to have one of our own. So we're very fortunate in that respect. However, let's press on with the main topic. I think you've all been affected over the last year by work being disrupted due to the pandemic, and I'm sure you've all got your own tales of working from home, whether it's good or bad. And the lockdown has taught us a number of things, and we were not prepared in all sorts of ways. We simply weren't prepared for the pandemic. And if we think about that in terms of the built environment and certainly in how office spaces were often unhealthy and artificial and cramped. And if we think about how the supermarkets had to react very quickly to social distancing with circulation routes and density, these things had to sort of play out somewhere else in some of the other more public areas and certainly in the workplace. And so the response in the workplace sector was to say, well, don't come in, just work from home. And of course, it's not a new idea, working from home. It's been with us for many years, and some professionals have worked from home all the time, but somehow it just seemed to gain traction because it was a viable way of maintaining business. And the changes and the suspension of normal behaviour was quite dramatic. And even with the near sort of total suspension of global aviation, it only saw a net reduction of about 7% of carbon emissions. So another thing that it's proved to us is that we really have to go much further if we want to have a much greener, sustainable future. And these things are going to be disruptive to our lives. IT and the internet obviously came in and saved the day for many people, and it converted our homes to become really multifunctional, that we could maintain certain aspects of normal life with a good internet connection and the right applications. So whether it's downloading a film or doing some home learning, whatever it might be, the internet and IT seem to be the future. And it's nudged a number of our old habits into the past. Hopefully, we don't necessarily need to make those short but long distance business trips as we used to, because clearly we can do that like this over Zoom and other platforms. And it led a number of commentators to predict fairly early on that the office was dead, which was to some degree. Some people have made a good go of that, but the other side to that coin is that there was a loss of passing trade for those businesses that depend on vibrant city centres. And so we need to be careful that we just don't jump to broad sort of conclusions before we've actually really had a thought about the long-term implications. And I don't think we really know the true economic impact, good or bad, of we all know the level of government borrowing, but we don't really know what the long-term implications are going to be. Fundamentally, we all missed social interaction, whether it's with our families, our friends, or our colleagues, and the sense of isolation that is one of the downsides of home working is a real issue. And as the picture shows, we've got this poor woman, or I don't know if it's, you could take a positive spin on this and say it's great, she's working and looking after her children at the same time. But I would imagine she's struggling to have a conference call while she's trying to keep an eye on the kids. And so despite the headlines that work from home is great, it's been a varied pattern for just about everybody, and it's favoured those with a spare room and those that are comfortable in their careers. But for the young, people entering the workforce for the first time, maybe in shared accommodation, really not so good. And what we really need to think about, if we're thinking about decent work and decent workplaces, we really need to think about those human workplace needs. We shouldn't just judge remote working, the success of remote working, purely on operational merits, because there are three elements to this, to making a good workplace. You've got the physical aspect of it, which is about creating a setting. And today that is a lot broader than it used to be. It could be a whole range of different types of settings, whether they're social, convivial, or whether they're for more concentrated, quiet work. We've then got the operational, which has clearly been dealt with by IT, that no longer do we have to go to a place of work to access physical resources. A lot of those are digital and virtual. But importantly, we have to think about the emotional benefits. I'm sure Oliver will get to this a bit later on. But the idea of that support and that career development, the mentoring, collaboration, and just being part of a culture. We can't underestimate the real value of those softer issues within a corporate organisation. It's not just about efficiency and output. It's actually about those values that you create, and they come from the more sort of emotional side of creating a workplace. And so let's just take a step back and I'm sure some of you probably know this sort of history of the workplace already, but just to sort of chart this, and I have to sort of pay credit to Neil Usher and his very interesting book, The Elemental Workplace, where he avoided all pretty pictures of new workplaces and treated it a bit like the periodic table, and he took the building blocks of a workplace, and he described the workplace of old, back at the turn of the 20th century, as being adoptive. It was very much a culture based on compliance and rules, and based around principles set out by F.W. Taylor in his Principles of Scientific Management, where it was all about individual tasks. It was offices were very much clerical factories. Everything was manual. And then at the other end of the spectrum, where we are today, Neil talks about modern workplaces being adaptive, that it's all about flexibility. And so, work has moved from being, it's partly a legacy of the Industrial Revolution, where work became a place, to really focusing back on the idea that work is actually an activity. Now, in parallel to that, we can see how through various developments that autonomy has increased, and certainly in the last 12 months with lockdown and the ability to working from home and choosing whether you're working in the garden or in the kitchen, or whether you need to do a bit of homeschooling. We've had that sort of freedom, and that genie's out of the bottle. That's not going back. People genuinely, thrive on that degree of autonomy, and so that's very much a characteristic of the workplace. And just to put that shift from clerical factory to work club into pictures, just got a series there very quickly. Picture one is largely regarded as the first purpose-built office building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright for the Larkin Soap Company in 1903 in Buffalo, New York. And picture two shows the inside, and nice, light and airy, perhaps, but just look at the layout. Down the centre, we have a row of female secretaries penned into their position by male managers on the outside. So not very egalitarian, not very sort of fluid. That culture carried on right through most of the 20th century. And picture of the 1950s, they could almost be, those rows of desks could almost be positions in a Roman galley with, people chained to their oars, being forced to work by somebody banging a drum at the end. I mean, it's all very mechanical and process-led. And the revolution started to happen in the mid-60s, and picture four is Action Office, the first panel-based system designed by Robert Probst for Herman Miller. And, this was partly a response to the fact that, America was in a much better place after the war financially or economically than Europe. And a lot of building led to these large buildings with big floor plates, steel frames. And it provided the degree of flexibility by using the furniture to actually create the individual areas. And that carried on. And the images along the bottom just show a slightly more contemporary view. So picture 6 is of the Perimeter Institute in Pasadena, where every vertical wall space is a writing space. And so this is about knowledge work. This is how, people come together, collaborate. And it's not just about sitting in front of a desk and shifting paper. It's actually about the creation of ideas and value. And then the last two pictures just show how we understand that the workplace isn't just about desks. That picture 7 is I think it's a building in Singapore, and it integrates a running track. So the idea of organisations understanding that workers need to the well-being of workers and health and activity is every part, corporate responsibility. And then picture 8 is probably a fairly extreme view of biophilia, but I won't go any further on that front because that's Oliver's territory. And so when we think about the workplace issues, there were a number of issues pre-lockdown which have really been kicked into touch and refocused as a result of the pandemic. Nomadic working has been a reality for many years, enabled by IT and mobile comms. It's been a corporate policy for some organisations for at least 10 years, maybe more. Offices increasingly have been designed around flexibility, which is something that Bob Probst talked about in the 60s, but it's really sort of relevant today. And it's work around activity. So if it's about collaboration, what are the right kind of spaces and where's the best place for that activity to be based? Demographics, another good piece of work by Jeremy Myerson at Helen Hamlin, that with people wanting to work longer and some people having to because of various issues about pensions and so on, that the workplace is going to be multi-generational, maybe 4 or 5 generations in the same workplace, and that requires a better understanding of how that space should function so that it's comfortable for everybody. And this is sort of led to an idea of health and well-being, not just physical health, but also mental health. But in the realms of physical health, certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen a real growth in trying to overcome the sedentary nature of office work, and no doubt you're all familiar with sit-stand workstations. Some organisations go as far as wanting to try to encourage better nutrition. I saw a project where a staff canteen had a living wall where you could they were growing salad crop and herbs, so you could integrate that into your lunch, and ideas about discounting foods that are low in sugar, salt and saturated fat. So this idea of making the workplace a lot healthier and bringing nature in, and we've seen this with the increase of biophilia. Sustainability is a really big issue. I think office buildings contribute something like 20 or 30% of carbon emissions, and they are incredibly wasteful. That Woods Bagot did a study back in 2007, a really great book called The 21st Century Guide to Life. And it looked at, if you think that an office, go back to the days of assigned desk where everyone had a desk, those desks were available 24/7. But we work on this idea that it's 9 to 5. That creates a rush hour, it creates congestion, but it also underutilizes that facility. And their research showed that a desk was probably only used for 9% of its available time. So if we increase the utilization rates of a building, then we can increase the sustainability. And this is really sort of playing out in some of this idea of remote working. So we really need to think differently about how we build better spaces. And the image that you see there is from a competition that we entered some years back, run by Mix magazine, and it was for number 8 First Street in Manchester, and it was an area called the Winter Garden, and this is where they were planning to devote a double height space, prime corner of the building, for a communal area that was mixed use. It was open to everyone, but it was an indoor-outdoor space. It had natural ventilation, and they were looking for ideas. And so our entry was commended, but we created this idea of a lot of planting, green walls. We created this sort of slightly more private space that we called the greenhouse. But then to manage solar gain and heat and light, we had these floating clouds that would be semi-translucent membranes that could be suspended from the ceiling but moved vertically and horizontally, so you could manage solar gain, create dappled light. But some of these ideas about outdoor, it's just this. This was a couple of years back, so this growing idea that a better connection to nature has been around in the office sector for a number of years. And so the pandemic and the lockdown has really boosted a number of trends that were evident beforehand. And in the course of the study that we recently did with Romy and Vestry, we looked at quite a few studies that have come out, and there's been no shortage of them in the past 12 months. The first quote is from a study done by KPMG where they surveyed 500 global CEOs, and in August last year, right in the middle of the first shutdown, 69% of CEOs said that they would probably downsize. Well, the same 500 people were surveyed earlier this year, and that's gone down to 17%. Now, I know that there's still quite a lot of interest in downsizing, and some of it's to do with breaks in lease clauses and property deals and so on. But clearly this sort of idea of whether downsizing is necessary is shifting. Another interesting study by Demos and Legal & General, where they were looking at places generally, they had a list of 9 key factors, and of the 20,000 respondents, 72% said that they would value fresh air, access to fresh air, as being the top priority. And this is something that is really beginning to sort of play out in some of the trade journals. And then probably the most sort of clear sort of statement from a study about the commercial property sector by Avison Young, where, quote here, there will be fewer desks and more outdoor and terrace spaces. Obviously, that's dependent on whether or not those spaces are available. And the pictures at the bottom just show a few ideas that are available. And the first one recognises the need for shade and power. And so the use of solar panels, possibly is one idea. And then the idea of more kind of open structures, gazebos or some kind of shelter as part and parcel of that outdoor work environment. But what we're really looking at right now is this sort of coming together of the physical workspace with the digital workspace, and working from home has clearly sort of enabled or has made the digital workspace a very clear winner. But we have to start to think about the physical workspace because we desire sort of contact and interaction. There's no doubt that with the choice of being able to work anywhere, and the rise in autonomy, that this model of hybrid is probably going to be as a successor. As a result, workplaces can be more fluid, and we need to think much broadly about what those settings are and where they are. And hybrid working can improve utilisation. So the figures that Woods Baggott presented some years back, if we think about breaking that 9 to 5 rush hour in 9% utilisation, and we think differently about spaces and where those spaces are, then you can get better utilisation out of space, which is ultimately going to also be an environmental benefit. The office isn't redundant as a result of all of that. It's just going to have to change. And for a number of years, we've seen a crossover between a number of what used to be fairly sort of different sectors, from corporate to hospitality and public. And there's a complete overlap between these areas right now. So it's quite a good time, if you're involved in any of those sort of sectors, to be thinking far broadly. And what we did with Vestry recently was looking at their existing product range. There are certain aspects of the workplace that simply can't be applied outdoors, like the use of really good high adjustable ergonomic task chairs. But if you take the standard work modes that we would normally use in an office design project, they apply to the outdoors. So whether the space is a shared space or it's more of a private space, whether you're working alone or together, there are a number of work modes that you can plot on that grid. And then you can just see what sort of furniture items you need to use in order to create those sorts of settings. And that's one of the images from the application guide that we did with Vestry. But thinking specifically about outdoor working considerations, climate is obviously a big thing. And if you search outdoor workspaces, then you're going to see lots of pictures from California and Sydney and sunny places. And obviously climate is a consideration, but that really depends on how you manage the space and where you are geographically. Think about the position, and we saw with the Winter Garden project that it doesn't necessarily have to be a rooftop or ground level, but clearly the position within the environment, within the building generally, is a key element. If it's at ground level, then it may have slightly more sort of public access to it. If it's on a rooftop, then are there other things that you need to think about in terms of AC units or other plant equipment? The setting is obviously a great advantage, that it throws up this sort of opportunity to use a mix of soft and hard landscaping and planting, and using planting to provide shade or aroma. There's a lot more to the sort of designer's palette, thinking about the outdoor, and I'm sure landscapers among you will be fully aware of how to use that to best advantage. We can't avoid shade. I mean, shade is really important, not just for in the temperate zone, but heat and light can be a problem, and certainly light's a problem if you're trying to use a laptop. But fundamentally, it's about thinking about the activity. What is that space going to be used for? Is it shared? Is it private? Is it for solo work? And the two images that you see there are others from the application guide, where we've taken standard vestry products and we've just used it. And products like Parklets is great for creating a pop-up work environment. You can run power and data underneath. It's a great way of sort of building on hard landscaping that may already be there. And what we've shown there is by using the pop screens, but with a solid infill, that you can create private sort of enclosed areas, so that there's a degree of privacy. This could be in a public concourse, but you've got some privacy to open your laptop and not have the content looked at by your neighbour. And so, the facilities, we need to think about the facilities, we need to think about networking, we need to think about the equipment, but it's all entirely achievable. And obviously, it has to be fit for being outdoors, which clearly Vestry are experts at. And so we took some of that thinking. We took the work modes model and we directly applied it to a number of sort of visuals. And this is possibly a bit unrealistic because we've crammed everything into one setting. But you can see from this image how a mixture of using standard products can be used for different types of settings, whether it's for concentration or whether it's more collaborative. And so really the shift in thinking about the workplace, it once used to be about space planning, which was really a headcount exercise of fitting everybody and all those physical resources into one space. But increasingly it's about placemaking. And if all those resources are available digitally, then it comes back to culture and community. And there's the work that we do, we often sort of refer to the Edward Ralph model of placemaking, because there is a certain kind of relevance to this idea that spaces need to be distinctive and help community grow and develop. And so last screen then, I think we've come through the pandemic with a new set of perspectives that safe, efficient, effective and sustainable are probably watchwords as we move forward. And we've seen that mass home working is operationally viable, but it's not great in terms of isolation and community or career progression. I mean, thinking about how younger people joining the workforce for the first time can actually move through whatever chosen profession they're in. If they only ever work from home, it just really doesn't stack up. And so it's likely that the hybrid model is going to be the way forward at the moment. Culture and community makes attractive spaces, and that attracts talent, and it brings together some of those more discernible elements of corporate culture. There's one of the interesting sort of responses to the pandemic and our concern about contagion is that there's better demand or growing demand for better air quality, as we've seen from some of the studies. And certainly the concern about the safety of using air conditioning, forced air systems as being a source of infection is a concern. And I think that where our buildings weren't necessarily ready for a pandemic, the idea of infection control and protocols to mitigate future pandemics are likely to exist. And that's where social distancing may be something that becomes a bit of a legacy. With more nomadic workforce, office density can change. We can create a variety of settings. We don't necessarily need to think about containing the entire workforce anymore. So, let's think broadly about that. And one of the ideas that seems to be gaining traction is this idea of what's called spoken hub, where corporations might have a small central hub, but they'll have a series of regional networks, which will allow their workers to avoid commuting, but still get out home so they can go to a place of work. And a couple of weeks back, I was attending a webinar, and the head of office development for RBS was talking about how they were developing a plan where they're going to convert some of their branches so that the upstairs offices will be co-working spaces for their customers to actually go and work if they're in town and need a safe place to work and a good internet connection. So this idea of, there are lots of ideas flying around at the moment, but this idea of spoken hub kind of suggests that people don't really want to go back to commuting because that's probably not a safe area to try and maintain some degree of social distancing. And part of that, I saw a report last year where it said that there would be a possible shift to out-of-town campuses rather than city centre. And this is partly to do with working in more low-rise buildings where you're not dependent on elevators and you can have outdoor space for car parking and whatever. I mean, all of these ideas are in the mix. But really, it comes down to people. It comes down to culture. And a quote from a study by CBRE that the reason companies will move is to do with people. It's location, space, facilities. And the picture is, I think, a really good example. It's an image of the new Google European HQ in what has been dubbed the King Cross Knowledge Quarter. And this is about clustering, partly, that just up the road we have the Francis Crick Institute, one of Europe's biggest research facility. Further north of this site, we have Centre St Martin's and all the talent that exists there. There are various sort of tech companies dotted around the place. And then we have Google that have created this building that ticks all kinds of boxes in terms of sustainable construction, the amount of wood that's being used in it. But it's topped off with this green space. This is if there's an emblem at the moment that we should look at as being an example of good architecture or good placemaking, this is possibly one of them. And so I think I would like to think positively that amidst all of the hardship and loss over the past 12 months, that it's given us a bit of a jolt, this pandemic, and we're going to be a bit more responsible. We're not going to do indulgence of short-term, long-distance business trips, and we will think more carefully about the sort of places that we inhabit and value that human connection. So that's all from me. So I hope that was of interest and useful.
Thank you, Barry. That was great. Really comprehensive overview of how we got to where we are. Would you stop sharing your screen and then Oliver can set up for his presentation? Thanks. I remember some of those offices actually filing things in the summer holidays for my dad for something like 50p a day. And they did, not quite 1903, but they did look like those horrific, ranked people. So we'll carry on the conversation after Oliver's presentation. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Romy, can you just tell me, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it's absolutely fine.
Lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much, Barry, for sharing your thoughts. Very, very sort of detailed and succinct analysis of what's going on in the workplace. I'd like to sort of pick up on some of the aspects that Barry mentioned and referenced. So essentially, just to sort of tell you a little bit more about who I am. My name's Oliver Heath. I'm an architectural and interior designer. I run a design practice called Oliver Heath Design. We're based in Brighton, and our focus is on health and well-being in the built environment. And our work predominantly looks at biophilic design within that sector. And what I wanted to do today is to tell you a little bit more about biophilic design and the value that it brings to the workplace, and some of the ideas that we can take perhaps from our traditional understanding of the interior design of the workplace and how those can be translated into exterior spaces, both to benefit sort of the individual working condition, but also how it can be used to enhance innovation and a sense of community and connection to the organization. Over the last 7 years, I've been a biophilic design ambassador with Interface Flooring, whose carpeting you can see here. And that's been a fantastic opportunity to explore the subject of health and well-being and biophilic design from all sorts of different angles and to realize different benefits by collating knowledge and data. My design practice, Oliver Heath Design, is essentially an organization that's split into two parts. We are researchers where we collate knowledge and data. So we look at sort of environmental studies that have been undertaken around the world. We write white papers. And then we also are a design company where we implement those, the ideas underpinned by those research studies into the different spaces that we create. A lot of the work over the last few years has been for kind of international organizations where we write biophilic and health and wellbeing design strategies, looking at how organizations can rethink their spaces with the lens of increasing a connection to nature. So it might be about looking at exterior spaces, but it's also about how we blur the line between interior and exterior spaces. It's not really about how we bring nature into the space, but it is about how we put people in a better, more open, more positive and optimistic state of mind to deliver on the intended tasks and functions of that space by enhancing their connection to nature. I'll explain more about why that's so valuable in a minute. So we undertake biophilic design strategies, we write white papers, which I'll tell you more about in a while. They're free to download and access. We also implement those through just drawing design packages and then also sort of on-site work, realizing those designs, as we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, which is a project called the Remind Studio in Victoria in London. So you might ask why health and well-being is now such an important subject. And perhaps that seems a stupid question, bearing in mind we've been in the middle of a pandemic. But even before this pandemic, our health and well-being was rising up to the fore of how we were thinking about many of the sort of buildings in the built environment and how we react to them for a number of reasons prior to the pandemic. Firstly, urbanization is very high. In the UK, 90% of us are now urbanized. We spend 90% of our lives indoors. During COVID, this time has probably increased with the added issue that we have a less diverse set of spaces that we can occupy. So we don't have all the different spaces, and we've realized actually that the four walls that we surround ourselves in do have a significant impact on our physical, mental, and emotional states. Added to this, we have a very high level of mobile technology. It's prolific in all aspects of our life, and it tends to seep in to other areas of our lives, like our social lives. And I think more and more through lockdown, we've seen this sort of seeping and the blurring of lines between our work lives and our private lives, and started to recognize actually just how damaging that is, particularly at either end of our days when we might be sort of getting ready for the day, particularly when we're going to sleep, and the intrusion of technology and interactions and the sort of social media and the news and our use of screens in spaces that would be traditionally associated with rest and recuperation. Added to that, of course, stress has always been, for the last few years, sort of endemic in our modern lives. Every year, the Health and Safety Executive undertakes a study. In the years 19 to 20, they found that stress, anxiety, and depression accounted for a staggering 51% of all work-related ill health and 55% of all working days lost. So stress has been an enormous impact. And although the design of our spaces, isn't solely responsible for the introduction of that stress, I think there's an enormous amount that we can do to alleviate stress, to put people in a better physical state, to help them to recuperate from physical and mental tasks better, to get them back to being at their best, and to integrating and communicating with their colleagues. Now, over the last 18 months, of course, we've seen COVID have an enormous impact on the workplace. Studies around the world have repeated this again and again. In April 2020, an Indian emergency telephone counselling service found that 46% of the callers had anxiety, 22% some form of depression, and 5% suicidal thoughts. 10% of UK adults reported symptoms of depression between 2019 and March 2020, and this rose, nearly doubled to 19% by June 2020. And more than 42% of people surveyed by the US Census Bureau in December 2020 reported symptoms of anxiety or depression. And this was nearly a quarter of that, 11% in December 2019. So clearly mental health issues are rising up the agenda, and we're needing to find ways to alleviate this, to recognize that there will probably be some level of post-traumatic stress as we head back to the workplace. We may initially feel that we'll kind of settle back into it, but of course we can't go through such life-changing circumstances as we've seen over the last 18 months without some wider impact on our colleagues and our workforce. And yet, You know, we all know the spaces where we feel good, where we feel great. And if I were to ask you to think of a space where you feel most happy, most calm, and most relaxed, and you were to picture that space in your mind, well, the chances are the space that you're thinking of is a space that does include elements of nature. Perhaps it includes elements of water, grass, trees, mountains, light, and clouds. And of course, we all know this. We know that when we want to recover from stress, anxiety, exhaustion, we head to the mountains, to the beaches, into the forests. And when we're in these spaces, we do feel that incredible sense of calm and relaxation wash over us. We know that nature makes us feel good. It helps us to recuperate, to reduce stress, to get back to being who we should be, to being at our best. And yet when we build buildings, they're quite different to the natural environments that we truly enjoy. So our work in biophilia is really about manifesting some of these kind of natural triggers that put us in a better physical and mental state. And if you don't know more about it, biophilia quite literally means a love of nature, and it explains humans' innate attraction to nature and natural processes. It's an idea that's been around since around the 1980s, when it was first popularized by the likes of Edward O. Wilson, when he recognized society's departure away from rural dwellings and into city centres. These ideas have since been developed by the likes of Stephen Kellett into a set of patterns or principles that allow us to bring elements of nature into the built environment, not for the sake of bringing nature in and selling plants, but actually to put people in a better physical and mental state by eliciting a similar emotional response to that which we have when we're surrounded in nature. Now, this is important to us because biophilia is, in a sense, an evolutionary design ethos. It suggests that actually as human beings, we've existed and evolved in nature for 99.5% of human evolution. And during that time, our senses were highly attuned to elements of nature for our basic human survival. We needed to rely on sight, smell, touch, sound, taste, and the other two senses of our vestibular senses. This is our sense of balance and proprioception, our perception of our body in space, as a means not just to survive, but also to thrive and to flourish. And our awareness of these environments was finely tuned. And we'd very quickly be able to recognize landscapes that could help us to survive, thrive, and flourish. And equally, and I think this is really important, to recognize landscapes that were potentially damaging or threatening to our survival. And going back to that image that Barry showed of the evolving workplace, think of all those rows of desks. And you can imagine just walking into one of those spaces now and your heart sinking the idea that this is where you're going to be spending all day. And thinking about the lack of diversity and the lack of sort of sensory input from some of those spaces must have just been absolutely soul destroying. So thinking about these senses and how we can create more rich, more multi-sensory and diverse spaces, I believe is the key to creating happier and healthier places into the future. Now, there are two different approaches to biophilic design. The first is by the godfather of biophilic design, Stephen Kellett, who took a socio-psychological approach. He looks at an approach that nature is applied as a means to enhance our connection to that place, to the spaces, but also the people in that space. The idea being that when we're in and around nature, it calms us down, it relaxes us, it puts us in a more positive, open and optimistic state. And when we're in that state, we feel better. We have a deeper connection to the place, but also we react better with the people around us. Then the second approach is Terrapin Bright Green's 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design, a summary of Stephen Kellett's approach that is a more neuroscientific approach that really looks at how nature puts us in a better physical and mental state. It reduces stress and helps us to relax and to recuperate better from intense periods of mental and physical activity. So we've got these two different approaches, and yet actually both of these approaches have the same three constructs. They're basically summed up by this idea of a direct connection to nature. So this is how we bring elements of real sensory forms of nature into the built environment and the workplace, be that water, trees, plants, natural light, fresh air, movement, and the subtle changes that we see both immediately as nature is dynamic, but also the subtle changes that we see throughout the year as nature grows and develops. The second is in what we call an indirect connection to nature. And this is how we evoke a feeling or mimic a sense of nature using natural materials, textures, shapes, patterns, and even forms that remind us of nature. And here we see an image of gardens in the bay in Singapore, these biomorphic shapes that remind us of biophilic fractals and the shapes of trees. And the third is the human spatial response. And it's how we create spaces that are exciting and stimulating and aspirational. You know, how do we get people to go back to work? But also recognizing that in many of these spaces, that's going to be stress and tension. We're going to feel exhausted, and we need to help people to relax and recuperate, getting back to being at their best. And you imagine a simple shed like this on the edge of a fjord could sort of deliver a number of these human spatial responses. It could be the space where you strip off and dive into the fjord, and it's incredibly invigorating. But it could also be a space where you sit, relax, and recuperate, and get a sense of retreat and prospect over this beautiful landscape. Now, I just want to kind of run over some of the sort of few key ideas that I think we should be picking up on from biophilic design principles and incorporating them into our exterior workspace. Now, firstly, natural light is absolutely fundamental to our appreciation of space. It connects us to the time of day, the season, the weather, but it's also fundamental to our health and well-being. And this chart of our circadian rhythm is really important. Now, we spend 90% of our lives indoors. Very often it's under a single color temperature of light. And yet, you know, when we spend more time outside, it has the ability to balance up our circadian rhythms, which are responsible for controlling our body's behavior and hormone release of melatonin and serotonin, the body's sleep-wake hormone. So when we have a balanced circadian rhythm, we're alert and can focus in the day, but we can also sleep better at night. So getting a good amount of natural light is absolutely fundamental, in part because when we're alert and awake in the daytime and we're able to sleep better at night, we're going to be able to kind of be more productive and healthier and more communicative in the day. Sleep is obviously really important, so getting the right amount of natural light is important for getting better sleep. In the UK, 2/3 of adults don't get the recommended 8 hours of sleep. 67% of adults suffer from disrupted sleep. Sleep deprivation is linked to a higher mortality risk. So getting the right amount of natural light is important. Getting out and about is fundamental to that. Getting what we call a photon shower, which is an intense burst of natural light. Plants and greenery, of course, we know that this is a fundamental part of biophilic design. Plants are these most amazing things that can have physical and psychological benefits to any space. And of course, outside spaces are going to be great for delivering an increased connection to plant life. When we have more plant life, it can help to prevent fatigue. It can speed up activities like call processing in call centers. Studies have shown that it can increase performance by 10 to 25% on tests of mental recall and functioning, increase productivity between 6 and 15%. It can reduce absenteeism, reduce staff turnover. But plants can also remind us the natural world by creating richness with biophilic fractals, patterns and textures and color. Many plants can remove toxins like brominated fire retardants and volatile organic compounds. They can improve acoustics. They can improve the spatial quality by screening. They can create more dynamic and interactive spaces. And they can also connect us to these wider natural processes as we see as nature changes throughout the seasons. Also, when we have plants, we create much more dynamic, lively spaces. And many of the spaces that we ask people to work in are often very static and very different to those wonderful, rich spaces that we inhabit in nature. And this idea of non-rhythmic sensory stimuli is really important, that sense of adding essentially a calming, non-threatening movement that we see in nature, like leaves moving on a tree or ripples moving across a pool of water, is really important to help people getting back to being at their best. And we have this idea of the attention restoration theory that suggests that, you know, whilst many of us use directed attention when we're undertaking specific tasks, when we look out onto nature, it creates what we call effortless attention, or a soft fascination, which goes a long way to aid attention restoration, getting people back to being at their best. It reduces eye strain from computers, it reduces fatigue. And we often suggest the use of an idea called the 20-20-20 rule, which essentially is every 20 minutes, you look out at a distance of 20 feet for 20 seconds. And ideally, that's improved if you're looking out onto gentle moving nature. And the human spatial response, this idea of prospect and retreat. Of course, when we create spaces, we need lots of spaces to sit and work, to meet and communicate, but we also really benefit from that idea of being able to survey spaces, to see potential threats, potential targets, and also spaces to relax and recuperate, to just have 5 minutes to answer a call, to sit and think about things, to process things, and getting back to being at our best. And I think many of these ideas have been applied to the interior spaces, but as we move outside, it's really important to think about how we're going to facilitate all those different activities outside. Activities such as quiet focused work, quiet meetings, larger creative meetings and town hall spaces, and how we collaborate. So what we've recently done is we've written a white paper called Creative Positive Spaces by Designing for Community, which you can download. And in this, what we did is we combined the work of psychologists Macmillan and Chavez and the work of Stephen Keller to create 7 elements for enhancing a sense of community in the workplace by using elements of nature. So these 7 elements are all about how we use nature to create an enhanced experience or for the occupants, but also find ways of connecting them to inspire a sense of communication, which will enhance that sense of potential innovation within an organization. So the 7 features, I'll run through them quickly, but you can read about them in the paper, is a diversity of spaces. So this is about having all sorts of different spaces that can serve the physical, mental, and emotional needs throughout the day. It might be about a variety of spaces, but also a variety of elements of furniture. The zoning of spaces helps people understand what spaces are for, to create distinct areas for activities. Soft boundaries are about having good sight lines, but also reducing that sense of ownership and reducing that sense of trespass, which allows people to mingle between spaces and give them the opportunity to mix and meet and share conversation. Added to that, this sense of collision spaces, corridor spaces where you can just have somewhere quiet to have a quiet conversation, places where people come together. It's that kind of water cooler moment. Growing spaces are about creating spaces that are adaptive to one's needs and to the environment. So spaces that are not only growing in terms of plants, but also can be changed for particular moments and activities. Sensory spaces are about thinking about how we zone areas with different sensory inputs, maybe about coffee or scent or fresh air. And triangulation is about bringing people together around particular activities. It's kind of like sitting around that campfire moment and how that campfire puts you in a different state of mind. And when you're in that state of mind, it's about how you interact with others around you and have inspiring, innovative conversations. Now, one lovely little example you'll probably know about is the parklets. It started in San Francisco, just tiny little spaces, originally designed to take over a couple of parking spaces. Studies showed that actually when parklets were introduced, there was an increase in foot traffic by 44%. There was an increase in people stopping and participating in stationary activity that went from 4 to 11 people at any given time. The number of bikes parked in an area rose, so indicating space was perceived as being safe, and an overall perception that this was space that was safe and clean to share. So this idea of a parklet is really nice because it's a very containable, accessible amount of nature and spaces for people to occupy that could be just dropped down almost anywhere. Now, if you'd like to know more about any of the white papers I've mentioned, these can be downloaded for free on our website, oliverheath.com/resources. We've written these with interface. So when you click on the link, you'll be taken through to the interface website where you can put your details in and download any of these for free to find out more about biophilic design or how to use biophilic design to design for community. And very lastly, just a little plug here for some of the other activity. We've recently written an online course. So if you'd like to know more about designing biophilic design in the home, you can download that course on our site. We've also started an exhibition called Planted, which is going to be on at King's Cross between the 24th and 26th of September. And that exhibition investigates sustainable design, urban greening and well-being. And lastly, our most recent book, Design a Healthy Home, which come out in DK Books, can be bought at online retailers. And if you'd like to follow us for more information, do follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn. Biophilic design, I think, is one of these kind of amazing new sciences that is both looking at the individual, but also its benefits of bringing people back together. And I think as we look forward to moving from work to home and investigate how we're going to be moving back into the office, that shared connection and opportunity to meet, collaborate, and connect is going to be absolutely fundamental. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Oliver. And the seagull was very evocative.
That's right.
made me think of my happy place by the sea anywhere. So yeah, that was perfectly timed. If we can bring Barry back in as well. Now we've got a couple of questions. And we'll try and keep more or less to time, but I think we'll run over a little bit. If you can stay with us, that would be great. So thank you both. That was fascinating. I hope everybody agrees that, you know, it was a good general coverage of the workplace and where we've been and where we're going, and then your particular insight into biophilia was really pertinent right now. Thank you both. So Stephen, hello Stephen, asked a couple of questions, and actually in some reading I was doing around this, I was thinking the same thing, because I was reading a lot about potential inequalities of not working in an office and why it's so important to actually reopen them, because not everybody has high-speed Wi-Fi, or even, you know, a decent laptop or a chair and table. And, you know, there are so many aspects that I think those of us that are fortunate enough to have all of that just forget. So Stephen's asked a couple of questions. The first is, are we over-egging the no need to work in the office or meet people now we have the internet thinking? And he says that we had phones for decades, or we have had phones for decades, but it hasn't stopped us going to meet clients, for instance. And in fact, some might say it's led to more travel and face-to-face meetings as we get to know more people. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And then I suppose, in a way associated, how do we prevent the further development of two classes of workers, where those who work in workplaces have nice, healthy conditions because of the beautiful designs we've seen, but those such as builders, drivers, fulfillment centres, no names mentioned here, work in poor conditions and are forgotten about or actually don't matter? So maybe one at a time. That's quite a lot to get through.
I don't mind going first. Well, I mean, I think it makes, there's a good point there that of the 30 to 40 million strong workforce in the UK, I think only something like 30% actually work in offices. So, you know, when we talk about the workplace, we've kind of hijacked that description, and there are many more people that work in other settings, as your respondent sort of highlighted. I think that there was a rush to over-egg the idea of working from home, and some of it was seen as being slightly relief that work continued because of the internet. But as you say, you know, not everybody has good internet connections. And Don, who we work with, he lives in London, works remotely to us. The minute lockdown started, his apartment building got full of people downloading films and trying to homeschool. So he resorted to using his 5G network when we had Skype calls. So the infrastructure isn't really there. And I think that there has been a bit of glossing over the realities, and the isolation and the lack of community is probably the bigger thing. So there may well be, you know, two classes of workers: those that sit on the end of the bed with a bad internet connection, and those that have got the luxury of a home office.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of discussion about exactly that. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Oliver, as well. I mean, you know, you talk about well-being and mental health, and you know, being stuck in your bedroom potentially 24 hours a day, no matter how many houseplants you have. You know, I don't know how we get around that.
No, I think we need to be very conscious that we're living at a time where we have a lot of people living in rented accommodation, and I'm fortunate to have a number of younger staff members in my office that constantly remind us that when we're talking about health and well-being, that not everybody has a dedicated study, and a lot of people are renting. You know, so you may be in a shared accommodation with maybe a kitchen and open plan dining living room, and people are working at home. And I think organisations need to take some responsibility for this, and not just assume it's okay for people who are working at home. So added to that, I mean, I think this lack of diversity, even if you're fortunate enough to have a dedicated workspace, having you know, this sort of diversity of spaces and experiences, it's really important to the human condition, just being able to get out and to travel, to go to a cafe, to a restaurant, to a theatre, the cinema, and you know, making sure that people have some diversity in their life. And I think ultimately this idea of diversity is important both for people and planet. We need a diversity of experiences, a diversity of spaces, and furniture to work in to undertake different tasks. And that sense of diversity is equally recognized in nature. And you know, we need to kind of bring elements of nature right into the heart of our cities to create that diversity. And if we support that sense of diversity in exterior spaces, that sense of diversity, biodiversity, will also support people's mental health and well-being. So in a way, you know, we're intrinsically connected to the health and well-being of our planet, into creating happier and healthier places to both live and work.
No, that's a good point. I better move on because I think we'll run over badly if I don't. From Stephen Phillips. Hello, Stephen. Really fascinating research, Barry, and like the pics of nature, Oliver. With many people working at home full time and starting to experience a hybrid way of working, how will the office have to change to attract people back in, and what activities are many people missing at home? What key outdoor work-based activities are better suited to outdoor space? Another tricky one.
Well, I think that you know, any kind of activity can be dealt with can be carried out in any kind of space, and it's really a question of choice and where you feel most comfortable. In some of it might be to do with just needing that connection with nature, and if you can't make that connection in the internal space, then if an outdoor space is available, then maybe that's the area where it can you know, be carried out better. What was the first part of the question, Romy? Because it was quite long.
Sorry, hang on a second. I'll have to bring it back up. Yes, with a hybrid way of working, how will the office have to change to attract people back in?
I think the kind of hybrid model. I think that you know, seeing that there are times when actually working from home is probably a good thing if you're properly equipped to do that. So if you need to concentrate on something, you don't need to connect with others, or literally physically interface with others, and you can do that at home. So the office, I think, is going to become more of a social hub where that interaction happens. Clearly, there should be a choice of space if you need to do something concentrated and quiet. But it's really more about interaction. It's not about, you know, rows and rows of people doing process-driven tasks as it used to be, because they don't exist anymore in quite the same number. So I think we're going to see lots of sort of versions of this club type office, as it's being termed.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, you know, a lot of the work that we did here in designing for community, but I think was very pertinent. We wrote this a couple of years ago, but this idea that, like Barry says, we're not necessarily going to be designing for every member of the staff to have a desk, but we're going to be rethinking the space. Because, you know, what's very clear to me is that, you know, we can have creative conversations over Zoom, but, you know, we're basically working on a format of 16:9 within a very limited time frame. And it really doesn't suit everyone. And I know that getting people back around the table, having incidental conversations, just bumping into each other, talking about things that are kind of inputting into your lives, little things that are kind of intuitive bells that are ringing, picking up on some of that, and having the time and the space to do that is really, really important. We have devised ways of working online, but getting people back into the office is going to be really important for enhancing that sense of community, for engaging people with organizations, for getting them to kind of understand and be part of the company values, to feel like they're part of a community is really, really important. And if you're just stuck at home, you're never going to kind of be truly kind of passionate and be embedded into that sense of activity. I mean, 80% of what we communicate is non-verbal. So, you know, having ways of getting people to meet and mix and mingle and having those incidental communications and conversations is absolutely fundamental. So that sense of community and how we design for it is really important. And I think it is a design question. You know, there is a cultural element to it about companies, but it is also about how we facilitate spaces that can enhance communities in a way that people don't even realize. I mean, that water cooler moment was never, you know, the water cooler was never there to bring people together, but that's what it became known as. So it's about how we facilitate design to do that. And thinking about the senses and that rich multi-sensory quality of space, so that when people walk into organizations, they get that sense that this is a place where life can not just survive, but thrive and flourish.
Exactly. And choose to be there. Yeah. Absolutely, not feel they have to. No, thank you. I think we'd better draw it to a close. It's run over a little, which I'm not surprised about, because both of the presentations were fantastic. Thank you. And Abu has mentioned what a good presentation from both of you, and also good to hear mental health and well-being being discussed. So thank you, Abu, one of our previous speakers. And I'd better just finish off by closing with the usual details, just to let you know what's coming and where we are at the moment. So bringing it up to a close, I hope you agree that what we've talked about today has clarified a little bit more about SDG 8.2 and how we can all make positive changes in the workplace. I think all of us listening today, I'm sure, are responsible in some way and could do that now that it might feel a little bit more tangible. That's the aim of what we're doing here with the Fika series. And just to remind you, if you don't want to miss out, do sign up to our newsletter on the contact page, and we'll definitely then be able to keep in touch with you about upcoming Fikas and other conversations that we're constantly having at Vestra. So don't miss out on that if you're not already signed up. Also, obviously, social media. We promote what we're doing again through many channels, but particularly Instagram. And just to let you know what's coming up, normally our Fikas are Fridays at 11, but as you will have noticed, hopefully, today wasn't the case. And next month also we're holding on a Thursday due to clashes. But next month we're really looking forward to welcoming Ruth and Jane to talk about reduced inequalities, SDG 10. And in August, people actually very close to Oliver talking about SDG 15, life on land and biophilic urbanism. And then in September, we're hoping to be sort of live from Planted, which Oliver mentioned. And do go and look that up because it's a fascinating new event that's going to be held at King's Cross this year. So we'll be talking about sustainable cities and communities there. Hope you've enjoyed this session and that you'll join us for future ones. Don't forget that these will count towards your CPD commitment. If you're a landscape architect particularly, you need to be carrying out CPD 5 hours per year on the climate emergency. So many of them actually do link very well to that. Don't forget our amazing prize and competition for a trip to the Plus, our new factory in Norway next year. Every one of you listening in will be put into a hat and be drawn for that at the end of the year. And please do get in touch if you have any thoughts or ideas, and or if you would like a CPD delivered to you directly. So thank you all again for joining, and particularly Oliver and Barry, and also my colleagues Matt and Jack, who are hidden in the background helping out with all the functions. And have a great weekend, or go hell from all of us. And I hope to see you again very soon. So, goodbye.